What happens when Hollywood royalty meets late-night television arrogance? You won't believe what unfolds when Denzel Washington sits down with Stephen Colbert for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. The tension was palpable from the moment the cameras started rolling, and by the end of the night, one of America's most respected actors would storm off set in a confrontation that has sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in the most explosive late-night television moment of the year. The Late Show's studio buzzed with anticipation as Denzel Washington made his entrance to thunderous applause. The Oscar-winning actor, there to promote his latest directorial effort, carried himself with the quiet dignity that has defined his decades-long career. But something felt different in the air that night. Colbert, known for his sharp wit and sometimes controversial takes, seemed unusually animated during the commercial break, his production team whispering frantically in his ear. As the cameras rolled and the interview began, Colbert's opening seemed standard enough. "Denzel Washington, everybody. Always a pleasure to have you here," he said with his trademark grin. But there was an edge to his voice, a subtle undertone that suggested this wouldn't be the usual Hollywood promotional tour stop. Washington, ever the professional, smiled graciously and settled into his chair. "Great to be here, Stephen. Thanks for having me back." The first few minutes proceeded normally, with Colbert asking about Washington's new film and his approach to directing. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, Colbert shifted gears. His questions became more pointed, more personal, touching on Washington's past comments about Hollywood's treatment of black actors and directors. "You've been pretty vocal about the industry's problems," Colbert said, leaning forward with an intensity that caught Washington off guard. "But some people might say you've been part of that system for decades. Isn't there a bit of hypocrisy there?" The studio audience grew noticeably quieter. Washington's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but those who knew him well could see the flash of irritation in his eyes. This wasn't the respectful interview he'd been expecting. "I think there's a difference between working within a system and being complicit in its worst aspects," Washington replied carefully, his voice maintaining its measured tone despite the provocative nature of the question. But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed emboldened by Washington's diplomatic response. "Come on, Denzel. You've made millions playing certain types of roles. Don't you think you bear some responsibility for perpetuating stereotypes?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Washington's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, the mask of Hollywood politeness slipped. "Stephen, I'm not sure where this is coming from, but I think you might want to check your facts before making those kinds of accusations." The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Audience members exchanged glances, unsure whether this was planned or if they were witnessing something genuinely uncomfortable unfold in real time. Colbert's production team could be seen gesturing frantically from the wings, but their host seemed determined to press forward. "I'm just asking the tough questions that need to be asked," Colbert said, with a shrug that felt more dismissive than casual. "You've built your career on playing the noble black man, the dignified character who rises above. But what about the real issues? What about the systemic problems you've benefited from?" Washington's composure began to crack. His hands, which had been resting casually on the chair's armrests, now gripped them tightly. "You know what, Stephen? I came here to talk about my work, about a film I'm proud of. I didn't come here to be lectured by someone who thinks they understand my experience better than I do." The audience was now completely silent, sensing that something unprecedented was happening. This wasn't the usual back and forth of late-night television. This felt real, raw, and potentially explosive. Colbert, rather than backing down or attempting to defuse the situation, seemed to double down. "Look, I'm just saying what a lot of people are thinking. You've had a privileged position in Hollywood for years. Maybe it's time to acknowledge that." The word privileged seemed to hit Washington like a physical blow. His entire demeanor changed, the carefully maintained facade of the gracious celebrity guest evaporating in an instant. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Washington fixed Colbert with a stare that could have cut glass. "Privileged?" Washington repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout could have. "You want to talk about privilege, Stephen?" And with those words, everyone in that studio knew they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. The silence that followed was deafening. Washington's question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, and Colbert, for perhaps the first time in his career, seemed genuinely caught off guard by the intensity radiating from his guest. The studio lights felt hotter suddenly, the space more confined, as if the very walls were closing in on this moment of reckoning. "You want to lecture me about privilege?" Washington continued, his voice gaining strength and authority with each word. "Let me tell you something about privilege, Stephen. Privilege is sitting behind that desk, making jokes about other people's struggles, never having to worry about whether the color of your skin will determine how you're perceived before you even open your mouth." Colbert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual quick wit seeming to abandon him. "Denzel, I think you're misunderstanding—" "No, you misunderstand," Washington cut him off with surgical precision. "Privilege is never having to wonder. If you got a job because of your talent or because someone needed to fill a quota, privilege is never having your success questioned or diminished because people assume you took someone else's spot." The camera operators continued filming, but their usual steady hands seemed to tremble slightly as they captured this unprecedented moment. Members of the studio audience were leaning forward in their seats, some covering their mouths in shock, others pulling out their phones despite the no-recording policy. Colbert, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far but unwilling to back down completely, attempted to regain control of the situation. "Look, I'm not trying to diminish your achievements. I'm just pointing out that—" "That what?" Washington's voice boomed across the studio, causing several audience members to actually jump in their seats. "That I should be grateful? That I should sit here quietly while you patronize me and reduce my 40-year career to some kind of sociological experiment?" The production team in the control room was in full panic mode. Producers were frantically whispering into headsets, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let this explosive moment play out. The show's director kept gesturing for them to keep rolling, sensing that they were capturing television history, albeit not the kind anyone had planned for. "I've earned everything I have," Washington continued, his composure completely shattered now, revealing the raw emotion beneath. "Every role, every award, every ounce of respect. I didn't get handed anything because of the color of my skin, Stephen. If anything, I had to work twice as hard to prove I belonged in rooms where people looked at me and saw limitations instead of possibilities." Colbert, his face flushed, and his usual smugness replaced by visible discomfort, tried once more to redirect. "I think we're getting off track here. This wasn't meant to be—" "Off track?" Washington laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No, Stephen, I think we're finally on track. You invited me here under the pretense of discussing my work, but what you really wanted was to put me in my place, wasn't it? To remind me that no matter how successful I become, I'm still just another black actor who should be grateful for whatever scraps Hollywood throws my way." The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Audience members were visibly uncomfortable, some whispering to each other, others staring in stunned silence. The usual energy of a late-night talk show had been completely replaced by something far more raw and real. Colbert, perhaps finally recognizing the gravity of what he had unleashed, attempted damage control. "Denzel, that's not what I meant at all. I have nothing but respect for your career and your contributions to—" "Respect?" Washington stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. "You call this respect? Ambushing me on national television with these accusations, questioning my integrity and my journey? The standing ovation that typically greeted Washington wherever he went was nowhere to be found. Instead, the audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing the complete breakdown of what should have been a routine celebrity interview. Some were recording on their phones despite security's attempts to stop them, knowing they were capturing a moment that would be dissected and analyzed for months to come. "I came here as a professional courtesy," Washington said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his disappointment and anger. "I've been doing interviews for 4 decades, Stephen. I've sat across from everyone from Barbara Walters to Oprah to 60 Minutes. I've never, ever been treated with such blatant disrespect." Colbert was now visibly sweating under the studio lights, his usual confidence completely evaporated. "I was just trying to have a meaningful conversation about important issues." "Meaningful?" Washington's voice cracked with incredulity. "You think blindsiding someone with personal attacks is meaningful? You think reducing a person's life work to talking points is journalism?" The control room was in complete chaos. Network executives who had been watching from their offices were now flooding the studio floor, unsure whether to intervene or let this unprecedented moment continue. The show's producers were caught between their journalistic instincts to let the drama unfold and their responsibility to protect both their host and their guest from further damage. But Washington wasn't finished. The years of slights, the decades of having to prove himself over and over again, the constant burden of representation, it all came pouring out in this moment of absolute truth. "You know what really gets me, Stephen?" Washington said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper again. "You sit here every night, making jokes, thinking you're some kind of moral authority. But when it comes down to it, you're just another person who thinks they can define my experience for me." And with that declaration, something shifted in the room, a point of no return that everyone present could feel. The atmosphere in the studio had become electric with tension. Washington stood towering over the desk, his presence commanding every corner of the room. Colbert, still seated, looked smaller somehow, diminished by the magnitude of what he had unleashed. The usual rhythm of late-night television had been completely shattered, replaced by something raw and unforgiving. "You want to know about privilege, Stephen?" Washington said, his voice now carrying the full authority of someone who had finally reached his breaking point. "Let me educate you. Privilege is never having to carry the weight of an entire community's expectations on your shoulders every time you walk onto a set. Privilege is never being told you're too intense or too serious, because God forbid a black man shows intelligence and depth." Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but Washington held up a hand that commanded immediate silence. The gesture was so powerful, so absolute in its authority, that even the production crew stopped their frantic movements to watch. "Privilege," Washington continued, his voice building like a crescendo, "is sitting in your comfortable chair, in your comfortable studio, making comfortable jokes about uncomfortable truths, and thinking that makes you enlightened. But real enlightenment, Stephen, comes from understanding that you don't get to define other people's journeys." The studio audience was completely mesmerized. Some were openly staring with their mouths agape. Others had tears in their eyes, witnessing what felt like a masterclass in dignity under fire. This wasn't just a celebrity meltdown or a publicity stunt gone wrong. This was a moment of profound truth-telling that transcended entertainment. Colbert, his face now red with embarrassment and possibly anger, finally found his voice. "I think you're being overly sensitive here, Denzel. This is exactly the kind of conversation we need to be having in this country." The words hung in the air like a lit fuse. Washington's expression changed completely, his eyes narrowing to laser focus. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. "Overly sensitive?" Washington repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more power than any shout. "Did you just tell me I'm being overly sensitive for objecting to being disrespected on your show?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the camera operators seemed frozen in place, afraid to make the slightest sound that might break this moment of absolute tension. "That's it," Washington said, beginning to remove his microphone with deliberate, controlled movements. "I've heard enough. I've been called many things in my career, Stephen, but I have never been called overly sensitive for demanding basic human respect." Colbert seemed to realize the full magnitude of his mistake, panic finally creeping into his voice. "Wait, Denzel, let's just take a breath here and—" "No," Washington said firmly, tossing his microphone onto the desk with a sharp crack that echoed through the studio. "There's no taking a breath. There's no walking this back. You showed your true colors tonight, and so did I." The production team was in full crisis mode now. Assistants were running back and forth. Executives were shouting into phones, and security personnel had appeared at the edges of the studio, unsure whether their intervention would be needed or welcome. Washington straightened his jacket with the same dignity he'd brought to countless red carpets and award shows. But this time there was something different about his bearing, a finality that everyone in the room could sense. "I've spent 40 years in this business conducting myself with professionalism and respect," Washington said, his voice now calm but carrying an unmistakable note of finality. "I've sat through countless interviews, answered the same questions, with patience and grace, because I understood that it was part of the job. But what happened here tonight? This crosses every line of professional courtesy and basic human decency." Colbert made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Denzel, please, let's just finish the interview and—" "The interview is over, Stephen," Washington said, cutting him off with quiet authority. "It was over the moment you decided to ambush me instead of having a conversation. It was over when you chose to lecture me about my own experience instead of listening. And it was definitely over when you called me overly sensitive for objecting to your disrespect." The camera continued rolling as Washington began walking toward the edge of the stage. His movement was deliberate, dignified, but unmistakably final. The studio audience watched in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's most respected figures prepared to make an exit that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" Washington said, turning back, one final time to face Colbert directly. "I actually came here tonight looking forward to this conversation. I've watched your show, I've respected your work, and I thought we could have a meaningful discussion about art, about storytelling, about the responsibility we have as people in the public eye." His words carried a sadness now, mixed with the anger and disappointment. "Instead, you chose to turn this into some kind of gotcha moment, some kind of performance where you could show off how woke you think you are by tearing down a black man who's been fighting these battles since before you even knew they existed." Colbert sat frozen in his chair, his usual quick wit completely abandoned. The magnitude of his miscalculation was written across his face as he watched one of the most respected figures in entertainment deliver what amounted to a masterclass in dignity and strength. "I hope this was worth it for you, Stephen," Washington said, his final words carrying the weight of absolute finality. "I hope whatever you thought you were accomplishing tonight was worth destroying the respect I had for you and your show." With that, Denzel Washington turned and walked off the stage with the same commanding presence he'd brought to countless movie screens. The studio erupted in a mixture of gasps, scattered applause, and stunned murmurs as one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history reached its dramatic conclusion. Colbert sat alone at his desk, the harsh studio lights revealing every line of stress and regret on his face, as the reality of what had just transpired began to sink in. The show that was supposed to be a routine promotional interview had instead become a defining moment that would be remembered long after both men's careers had ended. The cameras finally stopped rolling, but the impact of what had just unfolded would reverberate through social media, entertainment news, and public discourse for months to come. Denzel Washington had walked off that stage, but he had left behind a powerful reminder about dignity, respect, and the courage to stand up when those principles are under attack. In the end, it wasn't just a celebrity walking off a talk show. It was a masterclass in maintaining one's integrity when faced with disrespect, delivered by one of the most respected figures in American entertainment.